The Alabama sun had no mercy in August of 1842. It pressed down on the cotton fields of Harrow Plantation like a hot iron, flattening the air until it shimmered in waves that made the horizon look like water. It wasn't water. It never was. Just heat and dust and the long rows of white bolls waiting to be picked by hands that had stopped feeling pain years ago. Dinah moved through the cotton with the rhythm of someone who had been doing this since she could walk. 32 years old, though she looked older. The sun had carved lines into her face that spoke of decades under its gaze. Her hands were calloused, thick as boot leather, her back permanently bent from the weight of the sack she dragged behind her. She wore a faded blue dress that had been patched so many times the original fabric was hard to find, and a head wrap the color of dried blood. But it was her eyes that people remembered, dark and bottomless, like looking down a well at midnight. They didn't blink often. They didn't cry anymore. They just watched and calculated and remembered everything. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Keep moving, girl. The voice cut through the afternoon heat like a whip crack, though no whip followed. Not yet. Dinah didn't look up. She had learned long ago that looking at them only invited trouble. Her fingers continued their work, plucking the cotton bolls with mechanical precision, dropping them into the sack that grew heavier with each handful. Around her, 24 other enslaved people worked the same rows, their own silence speaking volumes about what words could not protect them from. The voice belonged to Samuel Crenshaw, the new overseer who had arrived at Harrow Plantation 3 months prior. He sat on a brown mare that looked as mean as he did, circling the fields like a hawk watching mice. Crenshaw was a tall man, gaunt in the way that made his bones seem too large for his skin. His face was all angles and shadows, even in direct sunlight, and his teeth were the color of tobacco spit. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast his eyes in permanent shadow, but everyone could feel when those eyes landed on them. He had brought 2 other men with him, Pike and Jessup. They rode behind him now, their own horses kicking up red dust that settled on everything like dried blood. Pike was shorter but broader, with arms thick as fence posts, and a neck that seemed to emerge directly from his shoulders without the courtesy of a proper joining. Jessup was younger, maybe 25, with a baby face that made his cruelty somehow worse, like watching a child torture ants. I said move. Crenshaw pulled his horse closer to Dinah's row. The animal's hot breath made the cotton plants shiver. Dinah's fingers never stopped. Pick, drop, pick, drop. The rhythm was survival. The rhythm was invisible. She had perfected the art of seeming busy while going exactly the same pace she always did. Too fast and you'd finish your row while others still worked, meaning more rows to pick. Too slow and you'd taste the whip. The sweet spot was a pace that looked like effort, but conserved energy for the 16-hour days that stretched from before dawn until the stars came out. You deaf woman, Crenshaw's voice had moved closer. His shadow fell over her now, blocking the sun in a way that should have been relief, but felt like a threat. No, sir. Dinah's voice was quiet, neutral. The voice of someone who had learned that any emotion could be used against you. Just working, sir. Working, Crenshaw repeated as if tasting the word. That what you call this? Looks to me like you're moving slower than molasses in January. No, sir. Same pace as always, sir. You calling me a liar? His voice had gone soft now, which was more dangerous than yelling. Yelling meant he was just angry. Soft meant he was looking for an excuse. Dinah kept picking. No, sir. Behind Crenshaw, Pike laughed, a wet, phlegmy sound. She's got a mouth on her, Samuel. Might need to teach her some manners. Might be you're right, Pike. Crenshaw shifted in his saddle, and Dinah heard the creak of leather that meant he was reaching for something. The whip, probably. Or the club he kept strapped to his belt, a thick piece of hickory wood that he'd named the preacher, because, as he liked to say, it taught lessons that stuck. But then a child's voice called out from 3 rows over, "Mama! Mama, come quick!" The distraction was enough. Crenshaw turned his horse toward the sound, momentarily forgetting Dinah. She didn't let herself feel relief. Relief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She just kept picking, even as she tracked the overseer's movement through the fields with her peripheral vision. The child who had called out was maybe 7 years old, small for his age from years of not getting enough food. He stood next to a woman who had collapsed between the rows, her cotton sack spilled around her like snow. The woman's name was Ruth, and she was pregnant, 6 months along, though Master Harrow would work her until the baby came and then give her 2 days before putting her back in the fields. "Get up!" Crenshaw's voice carried across the field. "I don't care if you're dead. You got a quota to meet." Ruth didn't move. Her son tugged at her arm, his small face twisted with fear. Jessup rode up beside Crenshaw. "Want me to encourage her? Be my guest." What happened next, Dinah didn't watch. She'd seen it too many times before. The sound of Jessup's boot connecting with flesh, Ruth's groan, the child sobbing, the other workers carefully not looking, because looking meant you might be next. Dinah just kept picking. Pick, drop, pick, drop. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was somewhere else, somewhere dark and still, like the bottom of a deep well where even sound couldn't reach. She had been at Harrow Plantation for 10 years. Before that, she'd been sold 4 times, twice before she was old enough to remember, once at 13 and once at 19. Each sale had taken her further south, deeper into the heart of Alabama, where the plantations grew larger, and the cruelty grew with them. Her back carried the scars of 3 different overseers' whips. Her wrists bore the marks of chains. Her heart carried the weight of 2 children she'd been separated from in previous sales, their faces now blurred by time and trauma, until she couldn't remember if they'd had her eyes or their father's. But she remembered everything else, every blow, every degradation, every moment of casual cruelty that the overseers and the master and his family performed as easily as breathing. She remembered it all with the perfect clarity of someone who understood that memory was the only weapon she'd ever be allowed to keep. "All right, you lazy animals. Time for water," Crenshaw's voice rang out across the field. It was 4 o'clock. The single 15-minute break they'd get before working until dark. The enslaved people moved toward the water barrel at the edge of the field, a slow migration of exhausted bodies. Dinah went last, as always. The water would be warm and cloudy by the time she got there, but that was safer than pushing ahead and drawing attention. As she approached the barrel, she noticed a boy standing nearby. Her son, Thomas, 15 years old and growing tall despite the starvation diet they all endured. He had his father's height, but her eyes, those dark, watching eyes that saw everything and forgot nothing. Thomas didn't look at her directly. They'd learned it was safer not to show obvious affection. But he shifted his position so that when she reached for the ladle, their hands would touch for just a moment. Skin to skin, the only intimacy allowed in a world designed to strip them of everything human. "Mama," he whispered, so quiet that only she could hear. "I'm hungry." "I know, baby. Tonight I'll slip you extra cornbread." They watching the kitchen close now. After Mary got caught, "I'll manage." Mary had been caught stealing a sweet potato 2 weeks ago. They'd tied her to the whipping post and given her 20 lashes while forcing everyone to watch. The message was clear: even your hunger belongs to us. But Dinah had been stealing food for years. Small amounts, never enough to be noticed. A handful of cornmeal here, a piece of salt pork there. She'd learned to be invisible, to move through the plantation's buildings like smoke, there and gone, before anyone could focus on her presence. "Boy!" Pike's voice boomed across the clearing. "You the one belongs to Dinah." Thomas's face went carefully blank. "Yes, sir." "Come here." Dinah's heart, which she had thought long past the ability to feel fear, seized in her chest. She watched as Thomas walked toward Pike, his steps steady, despite what must have been terror. The boy had learned young not to show weakness. Pike looked down at Thomas from his horse, his meaty face split into something that might have been a smile on a human. "You're getting big, strong. Bet you eat a lot." "No more than I'm given, sir." "That's so." Pike glanced at Crenshaw, who had ridden over to see what was happening. "Samuel, you think this boy looks well fed to you?" Crenshaw studied Thomas like a man examining a horse at auction. "Hard to say, Pike. Might be he's been getting extra rations somewhere." "Might be." Dinah knew where this was going. She'd seen this game played out 100 times. They were bored, and they'd found a new target. The only question was what form the cruelty would take. "Sir," Thomas said, his voice steady, "I only eat what's given at supper. Nothing more. You calling us liars, boy?" "No, sir, just telling the truth, sir." Jessup, who had been watching with his usual baby-faced interest, spoke up. Could search his cabin, see if they got any hidden food stores. "Good thinking, Jessup." Crenshaw nodded. "Pike, you and Jessup go check out cabin 12. That's where this one sleeps, ain't it?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said. His eyes flickered to Dinah for just a moment, so quick that only she caught it. And in that moment, she knew. There was cornbread in the cabin. Half a loaf that she'd made yesterday from stolen meal, baked in the coals of their small fire, hidden under a loose board beneath her sleeping mat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them both whipped. Or worse. Her mind raced through options. She could confess now, claim it was all her doing, but that wouldn't save Thomas from punishment. In the overseer's minds, he would have eaten the stolen bread, making him guilty too. She could try to run to the cabin first, destroy the evidence, but she'd never make it in time, and the attempt would only confirm their guilt, so she did the only thing she could do. She made her face blank, she kept her breathing steady, and she waited. Pike and Jessup rode off toward the slave cabins, their horses kicking up red dust. The other enslaved people carefully returned to drinking water, their eyes averted. Thomas stood frozen where Pike had left him, his young face struggling to maintain its mask. Crenshaw stayed behind, watching Dinah with those shadow-hidden eyes. "You look worried, Dinah." "No, sir." "No? Your boy's about to have his home searched for stolen property, and you're not worried?" "He's a good boy, sir. Follows the rules." "That's so." Crenshaw leaned forward in his saddle. "You know what we do to thieves here, don't you, Dinah?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me." She didn't want to say it. Saying it felt like conjuring it into being, but refusing to answer would be worse. 20 lashes at the post, sir. That's for the first offence. You know what happens on the second offence?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me." 40 lashes, sir, and a day in the hot box." The hot box was a wooden crate barely large enough for a human body, left in direct sun for 24 hours. Most people who went in came out broken in ways that had nothing to do with their bodies. "And the third offence?" Crenshaw's voice was almost gentle now, like a father explaining consequences to a child. Dinah's voice came out as a whisper. "Sale. Separation from family." "That's right." Crenshaw sat back, satisfied. "Now, we wait and see what Pike and Jessup find." The 15 minutes stretched into 30, then 40. The enslaved people stood or sat in the shade of the oak tree, not daring to return to the fields without permission, not daring to speak. Thomas remained where he was, statue still. Dinah stood apart from the group, her eyes fixed on the distant cabins where Pike and Jessup had disappeared. Finally, the two overseers emerged. Even from a distance, Dinah could see that Pike was holding something wrapped in cloth, her bread. They rode back slowly, taking their time, enjoying the anticipation. When they reached the group, Pike dismounted and walked over to Crenshaw, holding out the cloth-wrapped bundle like a trophy. "Found this under her sleeping mat. Fresh cornbread, made from stolen meal, I'd wager." Crenshaw took the bread, unwrapped it, broke off a piece and smelled it. Still warm. "Made today, probably." He looked at Thomas. "This your handiwork, boy?" "No, sir." "Then whose?" Thomas's eyes flickered to his mother again. The boy was strong, but he was 15. He didn't have years of practice at lying, at hiding, at surviving through deception. Before he could speak, Dinah stepped forward. "It's mine, sir." Every head turned toward her. Even the other enslaved people seemed surprised. Confessing was never wise. It only made the punishment certain instead of likely. But Dinah had made a calculation. They'd already found the bread. Denial would just make it worse, and if she confessed, maybe they'd leave Thomas alone. "Yours," Crenshaw repeated. "You stole the cornmeal. You made the bread. You hid it." "Yes, sir." And the boy knew nothing about it. This was the dangerous part. If she said yes, they might not believe her. If she said no, Thomas would be punished too. "He knew," Dinah said, "but he didn't eat none of it. I made it for myself. He told me not to, said I'd get caught. He was right." It was a good lie, good enough that even Crenshaw seemed to consider it. "That true, boy? You told her not to steal?" Thomas's face showed his confusion. He clearly hadn't expected his mother to lie, but he was smart enough to follow her lead. "Yes, sir. Told her it wasn't worth the risk, but she gets powerful hungry sometimes, sir. Light-headed. I think she was scared she'd collapse in the fields." Another good addition, making it about survival rather than greed, making her seem weak and desperate rather than defiant and rebellious. Crenshaw studied them both for a long moment. Then he smiled, and Dinah knew they hadn't escaped anything. He'd seen through the lie, or he didn't care about the truth. Either way, he'd found his entertainment for the evening. 20 lashes, Crenshaw said, at sunset so everyone can watch. String her up at the post. Make an example. "Yes, sir," Pike said, grinning. "And the boy?" Jessup asked. "What do we do with him?" Crenshaw pretended to think about it. "The boy tried to stop his mama from stealing. That shows good sense. But he failed to report it to us, which is a violation. I think he needs to learn the importance of loyalty to the master." He turned to Thomas. "You'll be the one to give your mama the first lash. After that, Pike takes over." The words hit Dinah like a physical blow. Not because of the whipping, she'd survived that before. But making Thomas participate, making him complicit in her pain, that was a cruelty designed to break something deeper than flesh. "No," Thomas said, the word escaping before he could stop it. "Please, sir, I can't." "You will," Crenshaw said, his voice gone hard. "Or you'll both get 40 lashes, and I'll sell you to a plantation in Mississippi, so deep in the swamps your mama will never learn what happened to you. Your choice, boy." Thomas looked at his mother. His eyes were wet now, all the strength drained from his face. He was 15 again, just a child being asked to do the impossible. Dinah met his gaze and nodded once. "It's okay," that nod said. "Do what you must. Survive." "Yes, sir," Thomas whispered. "I'll do it." "Good boy." Crenshaw remounted his horse. "Now everyone get back to work. We'll handle this business at sunset. And let this be a lesson to all of you. Theft will not be tolerated at Harrow Plantation. Not now. Not ever." The enslaved people returned to the fields in silence. Dinah walked back to her row, picked up her sack, and continued picking cotton. Pick, drop, pick, drop. The rhythm was survival. The rhythm was invisible. But inside, in that deep, dark place where she kept all her rage and all her grief, something shifted. A decision was made. Not yet. Not today, but soon, very soon. Because Dinah had learned many things in her 32 years. She'd learned how to hide, how to endure, how to disappear into silence and stillness until the monsters forgot she was human enough to be a threat. But she'd also learned how to wait, and sometimes waiting was the most dangerous thing of all. The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the Alabama sky in shades of red that looked too much like blood. And in the hog pen behind the barn, the animals stirred restlessly, their feeding trough empty for the 3rd day in a row, their small eyes watching the workers pass with an ancient hunger that even they didn't fully understand yet. The sun hung low and bloated over Harrow Plantation, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. purple and red and deep orange, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. The cotton fields had emptied, the day's quota met or nearly met, and now the enslaved people gathered in the clearing behind the main house where the whipping post stood. It was an old post, that wooden column, 12 feet tall, made from oak that had been seasoned and darkened by weather and blood. The wood was smooth where countless hands had gripped it, rough where fingernails had clawed. At the top, an iron ring had been bolted through the wood, rusted now, but still strong. Strong enough to hold anyone who needed holding. Dinah stood near the post, her wrists not yet bound, waiting. She'd been through this before, 3 years ago, when she'd been caught sneaking extra water to the fields during a heat wave. 15 lashes that time. She'd survived. She'd healed from 20. But the part with Thomas, that was new. That was designed to leave scars that wouldn't show on skin. Master Harrow stood on the porch of the main house watching. He was a portly man in his late 50s, with mutton chops that connected to his moustache and small eyes that disappeared into the fat of his face when he smiled. He wore a white linen suit despite the heat, and he held a glass of what looked like whiskey. His wife stood beside him, fanning herself with a painted fan, her expression one of mild distaste, not at the punishment, but at having to witness it before supper. Crenshaw stood near the post, the whip coiled in his hands. It was a proper overseer's whip, 12 feet of braided leather, tapering to a cruel point. Pike and Jessup flanked him, their faces bright with anticipation. The enslaved people formed a loose circle around the post. Attendance was mandatory. Master Harrow insisted that everyone witness punishments, believing it kept the others in line. Dinah could see old Moses, who was near 70 and could barely stand. Young Sarah, who was pregnant and looked ready to faint. Ezekiel, who'd been at Harrow his whole life and whose eyes had gone dead years ago. Ruth, recovered from her collapse earlier, holding her son's hand. And Thomas. Standing alone, separate from the group, his face carefully blank. Crenshaw had given him the whip already. A shorter one, not the full overseer's lash, but still capable of cutting skin. "Bring her forward," Crenshaw called out. 2 of the male slaves, chosen because they were large and strong, forced to be complicit, stepped forward and took Dinah's arms. She didn't resist. Resistance only made it worse. They walked her to the post, and she placed her palms against the wood, feeling its familiar smoothness. How many others had stood exactly where she stood now? How many had bled into this same dirt? Pike tied her wrists to the iron ring, pulling the rope tight enough that she had to stand on her toes to keep the pressure off her shoulders. Then he grabbed the back of her dress and ripped it open, exposing her back to the evening air. The scars from previous whippings showed clearly in the fading light, raised welts that had healed into ridges. Some straight, some crossed, making a map of pain across her dark skin. "Look at that," Jessup said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Already decorated. Let's add some fresh lines to the picture." A few nervous laughs from the crowd, not because anything was funny, but because laughing felt safer than silence. Crenshaw held up the stolen cornbread for everyone to see. This woman stole from Master Harrow, stole food that belongs to him, made by his meal, cooked in his time. Theft is a sin against God and against the natural order. The Bible is clear, servants must obey their masters. So Dinah here is not just a thief, she's a sinner, and sin must be punished. He paused, letting his words sink in. But Master Harrow is a merciful man. Instead of 40 lashes or the hot box or sale, she'll receive only 20. And her boy will have the honor of delivering the first blow, to teach him the importance of loyalty. Crenshaw turned to Thomas. "Come here, boy." Thomas walked forward. Each step looked like it took all his strength. When he reached the post, Crenshaw handed him the whip and positioned him about 6 feet from Dinah's exposed back. "Now, you're going to pull back your arm like this," Crenshaw demonstrated, "and bring it forward with force. The whip should crack across her shoulders. You understand?" "Yes, sir." Thomas's voice was barely audible. "I can't hear you, boy." "Yes, sir." louder now, but breaking. Dinah turned her head just slightly. She could see Thomas in her peripheral vision, could see him gripping the whip with shaking hands. "It's all right, baby," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear. "Do what you must." "I can't." "You can, you will, and I forgive you." "Mama, enough talking." Crenshaw's voice cut through. "Do it now, boy, or I'll add 10 more lashes for disobedience." Thomas raised the whip. His whole body was trembling. Tears ran down his face, catching the last light of the sun. "Do it!" Crenshaw shouted. The whip came down. Thomas had pulled the blow, tried to make it soft, but the leather still bit into Dinah's shoulder. She gasped, couldn't help it, but didn't scream. The pain was sharp and hot, like a line of fire drawn across her skin. "Pathetic," Crenshaw said. "That wouldn't hurt a child, but it counts as one. Pike, take over." Pike grabbed the longer whip from Crenshaw's hands and took position. He didn't hesitate, didn't show mercy. The whip cracked through the air and landed across Dinah's back with the sound of splitting meat. This time, Dinah did cry out. Pike knew how to use a whip, knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum pain without causing damage that would keep a slave from working. "Two!" Crenshaw called out. The whip came again, and again. Pike fell into a rhythm, each strike measured and precise. The leather cut through skin, opened old scars, created new ones. Blood began to run down Dinah's back in thin streams, soaking into the waistband of her torn dress. 6. Dinah's legs gave out. She hung from the rope now, her full weight on her wrists. The iron ring creaked but held. Her breathing came in ragged gasps. She bit her lip until it bled, trying not to give them the satisfaction of her screams. 10! Halfway there. The pain had moved beyond sharp, into something duller and more terrible, a spreading heat that consumed her entire back. She could feel the blood dripping down her legs now, pooling in the dirt beneath her feet. 14! In the crowd, someone sobbed. Thomas, probably. Or maybe Ruth, or maybe all of them, weeping for her, weeping for themselves, weeping for the impossibility of their situation. 18! Almost done. Dinah's vision had started to grey at the edges. Her body was trying to escape into unconsciousness, but she fought it. She would not give them that either. She would endure every moment, feel every strike, remember every second of this. 20! The final blow landed across her lower back, and Pike stepped away, breathing hard from the exertion. The whip dripped red. "Cut her down," Crenshaw said. The 2 men who had tied her up now cut the ropes. Dinah collapsed into the dirt, unable to stand. Her back was a ruin of torn flesh and blood. The evening air stung like salt in a wound. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Master Harrow called from his porch. His voice was slightly slurred from the whiskey. "Steal from me, and you will be punished. No exceptions. Now clean her up and get her back to her cabin, and someone feed those damn hogs. They've been squealing for days." The crowd began to disperse. Thomas rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside his mother. "Mama, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Hush," Dinah whispered. Her voice was rough, damaged from held-back screams. "Not your fault, never your fault." Old Moses and 2 other men helped lift Dinah. They carried her toward the slave cabins, Thomas following close behind. Ruth came too, bringing a bucket of water and clean rags to tend the wounds. As they walked, Dinah's head lolled to the side. Through the pain and the blood loss and the grey creeping into her vision, she saw the hog pen. The animals pressed against the fence, watching them pass. Their eyes caught the last light of the sun and glowed red. Hungry, Dinah thought. They're so hungry. And deep in that dark place where she kept her rage, something began to take shape. Not a plan yet, but the seed of one, the beginning of an idea that would grow in the days to come. They reached cabin 12 and brought Dinah inside. The cabin was small, 1 room, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with a dirt floor and walls made of rough-hewn planks that didn't quite meet, letting in rain and wind and the cold. 2 sleeping mats lay on the floor. A small fire pit sat in the center, Beneath a hole in the roof that served as a chimney, a single wooden bucket held their water. That was everything they owned in the world. Ruth set to work cleaning the wounds, dipping the rags in the bucket and dabbing gently at the torn flesh. Dinah bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming. Each touch felt like being whipped all over again. "Some of these are deep," Ruth said quietly. "Might get infected." "They always do," old Moses added. He'd been whipped more times than anyone could count and bore the scars to prove it. "But she's strong. She'll heal." Thomas sat in the corner, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. After Ruth had done what she could, the others left, closing the cabin door behind them. The plantation was quiet now, except for the sound of crickets, and in the distance the squealing of the hogs. Dinah lay on her stomach on her sleeping mat, unable to lie any other way. The pain was still immense, but it had settled into something almost bearable. "Almost. Thomas," she whispered. The boy looked up, his face wet with tears. "Mama? Come here!" He crawled over to her mat and sat beside her, careful not to touch her back. "Listen to me," Dinah said. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were as hard and dark as ever. "What happened today wasn't your fault. You hear me? They made you do it. They're the ones with the sin. But I hurt you. You survived. That's what matters. You did what you had to do to survive." "I hate them," Thomas said, and the venom in his young voice was startling. "I hate them so much, Mama. I wish they were dead. I wish they'd all die." "Hush now." Dinah reached out and took his hand. "Hate like that will eat you alive, baby. You gotta be smarter than that." "Then how? How do you stand it? How do you not hate them?" Dinah was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried a weight that made Thomas lean closer to hear. "I didn't say I don't hate them. I said you got to be smart about it. Hate that shows gets you killed. But hate that waits." She paused. "Hate that waits can do things, can change things, but only if you're patient." "I don't understand." "You will, someday." Dinah squeezed his hand. "Now let me rest." "And Thomas?" "Yes, Mama." "Don't you ever think about revenge. Don't even speak that word. Because revenge is a sin, you understand?" "Yes, Mama." "Good boy." Thomas eventually fell asleep in the corner, exhausted from the emotional trauma of the day. But Dinah lay awake, staring at the rough wood of the ceiling. The pain in her back was nothing compared to the pain in her heart, not from the whipping, but from having to watch her son participate in it, from seeing the light in his eyes dim a little more. She had lost 2 children already to the slave trade. She would not lose Thomas, not to sale, not to cruelty, not to the soul death that came from being broken by this system, which meant she needed to do something permanent. The idea that had begun to form during the whipping grew stronger now, fed by pain and rage and a mother's love that had been pushed beyond its breaking point. The Hogs, the starving Hogs, Crenshaw, Pike, Jessup. She would need to be patient, would need to wait for the right moment, would need to be more careful than she'd ever been in her life. But it could be done. It would be done. Because Dinah had learned something important over her 10 years at Harrow Plantation. She'd learned that the powerful rarely expected the powerless to fight back. They'd grown comfortable, complacent, confident in their superiority. And that complacency was a weakness. One that could be exploited by someone patient enough, smart enough, desperate enough. Dinah closed her eyes and began to plan. 3 weeks passed. Dinah's back healed slowly, the wounds closing into angry red scars that would eventually fade to white, but never fully disappear. She returned to the fields after 5 days, any longer, and Master Harrow would have docked her food rations, which she couldn't afford. The work was agony at first. Every movement pulled at the healing skin, threatening to tear the wounds open again. But Dinah had survived worse. She worked through the pain with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything. Pick and drop, invisible and unremarkable. But inside, she was watching, learning, preparing. Crenshaw, Pike, and Jessup had settled into a routine. They arrived at the plantation each morning at dawn, riding their horses from the small house they shared on the edge of Master Harrow's property. They spent the day patrolling the fields, administering punishments as they saw fit, and occasionally helping themselves to whatever took their fancy: a chicken from the coop, vegetables from the garden, sometimes even one of the enslaved women, though Master Harrow frowned on that because it complicated his breeding program. In the evenings, they ate supper together in the small house. The plantation's cook, a woman named Bessie, who was 60 years old and had been cooking for the Harrow family since she was a girl, prepared their meals. She brought the food to their house each evening at 6 o'clock, left it on the table, and returned to her own cabin. Dinah knew all this because she made it her business to know. She watched the overseers like a hawk watches prey, memorizing their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. And she found their weakness. They were greedy. Gluttons who ate better than anyone else on the plantation, even better than Master Harrow himself sometimes. They loved their food rich and plentiful, and they never suspected that someone might use that love against them. The 4th week after her whipping, Dinah approached Bessie in the kitchen house. It was late afternoon, and Bessie was preparing supper for the overseers: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and gravy. "Bessie," Dinah said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. The old woman looked up from her work. "Dinah, your back healing all right?" "Well enough." Dinah moved closer, lowering her voice. "I need to ask you something." Bessie's eyes narrowed. She'd survived 60 years by being cautious. "What kind of something?" "I want to help you cook supper for the overseers tomorrow." "Why?" "Because I want to learn. You won't be around forever, and someone needs to know how to cook proper. Might as well be me." It was a reasonable excuse. Enslaved people often apprenticed with each other, passing down skills that might make them more valuable and therefore less likely to be sold. But Bessie wasn't stupid. "That the only reason?" she asked. Dinah met her eyes. "No." A long moment of silence, then Bessie nodded slowly. "What you planning?" "Better you don't know. You going to hurt them?" "I'm going to feed them, that's all, just like you do every night." Another pause. Then Bessie smiled. A grim, knowing smile. "I didn't see you come in here tomorrow. Didn't hear nothing. Don't know nothing." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just be careful, child. What you're thinking about doing, it don't end well. Not for you. I know. And you're going to do it anyway." "Yes." Bessie turned back to her cooking. "Then make sure you do it right. Can't leave nothing half done. You understand?" "I understand." The next day, Dinah came to the kitchen house during the afternoon, when most of the other enslaved people were still in the fields. Bessie was there, preparing the evening meal. She didn't say anything when Dinah entered, just nodded toward the work table where vegetables needed chopping. Dinah set to work. She cut the collard greens, peeled the potatoes, breaded the chicken. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and she kept her face calm, unremarkable, just another woman doing kitchen work. But in the pocket of her dress, hidden beneath the fabric, was a small cloth bundle. Inside the bundle were the seeds and roots she'd been collecting for 3 weeks. Pokeweed roots, which grew wild near the hog pen, seeds from white snake root, which she'd found near the creek, and most importantly, oleander leaves, which grew in the ornamental bushes near the main house. All of them were poisonous. All of them grew wild on the plantation, so common that no one paid them any attention. And when ground together and mixed with food, they could cause symptoms that looked exactly like food poisoning: violent cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. Not enough to kill, though. Dinah didn't want them dead. Not yet. She wanted them weak, incapacitated, vulnerable. As Bessie stepped outside to fetch more firewood, Dinah pulled out the bundle. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady. She'd practiced this moment in her mind 100 times. There could be no hesitation, no mistakes. She opened the bundle and began to work. The poison went into the gravy, thick brown gravy that would disguise any bitter taste. She stirred it carefully, making sure it was evenly distributed. Not too much, just enough. By the time Bessie returned, Dinah had tucked the empty bundle back into her pocket and was innocently stirring the pot. "Gravy looks good," Bessie observed. "Learning from the best," Dinah replied. They finished preparing the meal in silence. When it was ready, Bessie loaded everything into a large basket and covered it with a clean cloth. This was usually when she would walk the food to the overseer's house. But today, Dinah spoke up. "Let me take it. Your knee's been hurting lately." "I can manage." Bessie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right, but you come straight back here. Don't linger. Don't do nothing but set the food down and leave." "I will." Dinah picked up the basket. It was heavy, laden with enough food to feed 3 grown men twice over. She walked out of the kitchen house and across the yard toward the overseer's quarters. A small wooden structure about 200 yards from the main house. The evening air was cool for late summer. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in gold and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the hogs squealing. They'd been fed today, but only a little. Master Harrow had complained about the cost of feed and ordered the portions reduced. Good, Dinah thought. Keep them hungry. She reached the overseer's house and knocked on the door. After a moment, Jessup opened it. His baby face split into a grin when he saw her. "Well, well, look who's brought supper." "Where's Bessie?" "Her knee's hurting, sir. I'm helping out." "That's so?" Jessup's eyes travelled up and down her body in a way that made Dinah's skin crawl. "Maybe you should help out more often. You're prettier than that old woman." Dinah kept her face neutral. "Just here to deliver the food, sir. Where should I put it?" "Tables inside." Jessup stepped aside to let her in. The overseer's house was simple but comfortable, more comfortable than any enslaved person would ever experience. A wooden table with 4 chairs, a potbelly stove in the corner, 3 cots along the walls, shelves holding personal belongings, bottles of whiskey, tobacco, playing cards, a Bible that looked like it had never been opened. Crenshaw sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. Pike lounged on one of the cots, picking his teeth with a knife. Both looked up when Dinah entered. "That's our supper?" Pike asked. "Bring it here, girl." Dinah set the basket on the table and began unpacking the food. Fried chicken still steaming, collard greens with bacon, fresh cornbread, and the gravy, rich and brown and deadly. "Smells good," Crenshaw observed. "Tell Bessie she outdid herself." "Yes, sir." Dinah backed toward the door. "Hold on," Crenshaw said. Dinah froze. Had he seen something, suspected something? "You're that woman we whipped a few weeks back, ain't you? The thief?" "Yes, sir." "Back healed up all right?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Wouldn't want to damage Master Harrow's property permanently." He smiled, showing his tobacco-stained teeth. "Now get out of here." Dinah left, closing the door behind her. She walked back across the yard with measured steps, forcing herself not to run, not to show any emotion. When she reached the kitchen house, Bessie was waiting. "It done?" the old woman asked. "It's done. Then God have mercy on us all." Dinah returned to her cabin. Thomas was already there, having been released from fieldwork early to help repair some fencing. He looked up when she entered. "Mama, you all right? You look strange." "I'm fine, baby. Just tired. Want me to heat up some water for your back? Ruth said it helps with the soreness." "That would be nice. Thank you." As Thomas worked to heat the water, Dinah sat on her mat and waited. There was nothing to do now but see if the poison worked. If it did, the overseers would get sick within a few hours. If it didn't, if she'd miscalculated the dose, or if they somehow didn't eat the food, then she'd have to try something else. But she didn't think she'd miscalculated. She'd been careful, precise, and those men were gluttons. They'd eat every bite. Night fell. Thomas treated Dinah's back with warm water and went to sleep. Dinah lay awake, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into darkness, the crickets, the distant hooting of an owl. And then, around 9 o'clock, something new, shouting, coming from the direction of the overseer's house. Dinah sat up, ignoring the pull of her healing wounds. She moved to the door of the cabin and cracked it open just enough to see out. Lights flickered in the overseer's house, more shouting. Then Pike stumbled out the door and vomited violently off the side of the porch. Even from this distance, Dinah could hear Crenshaw and Jessup inside, groaning in pain. It had worked. Dinah closed the door and returned to her mat. A small smile played across her lips, the first real smile she'd allowed herself in weeks. Phase 1 was complete. The next morning, the overseers didn't appear in the fields. Word spread quickly among the enslaved people. All 3 men had fallen violently ill during the night. Master Harrow himself had gone to check on them and found them in various states of misery. The master had sent for the doctor, who arrived around midday and declared it food poisoning, probably from the chicken. He prescribed rest, fluids, and time. Bessie was questioned, of course. Had the chicken been cooked properly? Where had it come from? She swore the chicken had been fresh killed that morning and cooked thoroughly. The doctor shrugged. These things happened sometimes. Bad luck. The men would recover in a few days. No one mentioned Dinah's involvement. No one suspected anything beyond random misfortune. For 3 days, the overseers remained in their house, too weak to even stand for long periods. Master Harrow had to supervise the fields himself, which he hated. He rode out on his horse, red-faced and sweating, shouting orders that everyone could tell he didn't fully understand. Without Crenshaw and his men, the enslaved people worked at a slightly slower pace, took slightly longer breaks, stole slightly more rest in the shade. It was a brief respite, a moment to breathe. But Dinah wasn't breathing easy. This was just the beginning. On the 4th day, the overseers emerged from their house. They looked terrible, pale, gaunt, moving slowly. Pike had lost at least 10 pounds. Jessup's baby face was drawn and sallow. Crenshaw seemed the worst of all, barely able to sit his horse, but determined to return to work anyway. "Probably shouldn't be up yet," Master Harrow observed when he saw them. "Doctor said to rest." "We're fine," Crenshaw rasped. His voice sounded like gravel. "Just need to get our strength back. Can't let these animals think they can slack off. Suit yourself. But take it easy today. No point making yourself worse." The overseers nodded and rode out to the fields. But Dinah could see they were struggling. They spent most of the day sitting in the shade, watching rather than actively patrolling. They had no energy for cruelty, no strength for punishment. Perfect. That evening, Dinah went to the kitchen house again. Bessie looked up when she entered, her expression wary. "You need to stop," the old woman said immediately. "Whatever you did, it worked. They're weak. Now leave it alone before someone figures it out." "I need to do it one more time," Dinah said quietly. "Tomorrow night, one more dose." "Why? You trying to kill them?" "No, just need them a little weaker. One more night." Bessie shook her head. "You're going to get caught. You're going to get us both killed." "I'll be careful." "No, that's what they all say, right up until they're swinging from a tree." But despite her protests, Bessie didn't stop Dinah from helping with the next evening's meal. And once again, when the old woman stepped out, Dinah added her poison to the gravy. The dose was smaller this time, just enough to weaken them further without making it obvious that something was wrong with the food. Just enough to keep them sick for another few days. Dinah delivered the food herself again. This time, none of the overseers even looked at her. They were too focused on the meal, too hungry after days of barely eating. She left and returned to her cabin. And that night, the shouting started again. By the 6th day, the overseers were in bad shape. They could barely leave their house. The doctor was called again, and this time he seemed puzzled. Food poisoning didn't usually last this long or return after seeming to improve. He bled them, thinking maybe they had bad humors. He prescribed laudanum for the pain, but mostly he told them to rest and pray. Crenshaw, Pike, and Jessup lay in their cots, miserable and weak and vulnerable. It was time. Dinah waited until midnight. The plantation was dark except for the lights in the main house, where Master Harrow was probably reading or drinking before bed. The slave cabins were silent. Everyone had learned to fall asleep fast. Sleep was the only escape available to them. Thomas slept in the corner of their cabin, his breathing deep and even. Dinah rose from her mat quietly and slipped out the door. The night was warm and moonless. Thick clouds covered the stars, making the darkness almost complete. Perfect. Dinah moved like a shadow, keeping close to the buildings, avoiding the open spaces where she might be seen. She reached the overseer's house and pressed her ear against the door. Inside, she could hear groaning, the sound of restless sleep, someone getting up to use the chamber pot. They were awake, but weak, distracted by their misery. Dinah moved around to the back of the house, where a window stood open to let in the cooler night air. She listened again. The sounds came from the other side of the room. Carefully, slowly, she reached through the window and found what she was looking for. Crenshaw's rifle, leaning against the wall where he'd left it. She pulled it through the window, inch by inch, barely breathing. If they heard her now, if they caught her, she'd be killed on the spot. No trial, no mercy. But they didn't hear. The rifle came through the window, and Dinah held it to her chest like a prayer. She moved away from the house and made her way to the barn, a large structure near the hog pen where tools and feed were stored. The barn doors were closed but not locked. She slipped inside. The darkness here was complete. Dinah stood still, letting her eyes adjust, listening to make sure she was alone. The barn smelled of hay and animal sweat and old wood. She could hear the hogs nearby, their restless movements, their constant low sounds of hunger. They'd been underfed for 2 weeks now. Master Harrow was cheap and feed was expensive. The hogs had become aggressive, fighting among themselves over scraps. Dinah had watched them carefully, noting how their small eyes tracked movement, how they rushed to the fence whenever anyone approached, hoping for food. Hogs would eat anything. Everyone knew that. Vegetables, grain, table scraps, and meat if it was available. Even human meat if they were hungry enough. There were stories about it, warnings passed down among enslaved people. Don't get too close to the hog pen. Don't fall in if you're bleeding. Hogs don't care what kind of meat they're eating. They just care that they're hungry. Dinah set the rifle down and moved to the corner of the barn where Bessie kept various supplies. She found what she needed, a bottle of laudanum, the same medicine the doctor had prescribed for the overseer's pain. But laudanum was also a sedative, and in large doses, it caused deep sleep. The doctor had left several bottles at the overseer's house. It wouldn't be hard for one to go missing. Dinah took the bottle and left the barn, moving now toward the overseer's house again. This was the most dangerous part. She had to get them to take the laudanum, enough to knock them into unconsciousness, but without them suspecting anything. She circled around to the front door and knocked quietly. After a moment, Jessup's voice called out weakly. "Who is it?" "It's Dinah, sir. Bessie sent me with medicine. Doctor's orders." Shuffling sounds. Then the door opened a crack. Jessup looked terrible, his face pale and sweaty in the lamplight. "What medicine?" "Laudanum, sir. Doctor said you're to take it for the pain. Bessie made you some tea to help it go down easier." It was a lie. But Jessup was too sick to question it. He took the bottle and the cup of tea Dinah had prepared earlier, actually just hot water with honey to disguise any taste. "How much?" "Doctor said 2 spoonfuls each, sir. In the tea." Jessup turned back to the room. "Crenshaw, Pike." "Medicine's here." Dinah heard groaning, then Pike's voice. "About damn time, give it here." She waited outside while they took the medicine. The laudanum she'd given them was triple the recommended dose. Combined with their weakened state from the poison, it should knock them out completely within 20 minutes. "All right, girl," Jessup said, returning to the door. "You can go." "Yes, sir. Feel better, sir." Dinah walked back toward the slave cabins. But once she was out of sight, she circled back and hid near the barn, watching the overseer's house. She waited. 20 minutes. 30. The lights in the house stayed on, then slowly dimmed as the lamps were turned down. No more sounds came from inside. Dinah waited another 10 minutes to be sure. Then she moved. She returned to the house and tried the door. Unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinges. Inside, all 3 men were unconscious. Crenshaw lay sprawled across his cot, mouth open, snoring. Pike had collapsed on the floor, too drugged to even make it to his bed. Jessup sat slumped in a chair, his head lolled back. They looked almost peaceful, almost human. Dinah felt nothing as she looked at them. No pity, no satisfaction, just a cold, calculating assessment of the task ahead. She couldn't move them by herself. They were too heavy, but she didn't need to move them far. Just to the barn, just to the hog pen. She went back outside and looked around. In the corner of the overseer's porch was a wheelbarrow used for hauling feed and supplies. It would do. One by one, she loaded the unconscious men into the wheelbarrow. It took all her strength. Crenshaw especially was dead weight, his long body awkward and difficult to maneuver, but Dinah had spent her life doing hard physical labor. Her muscles were stronger than they looked, her determination even stronger. She wheeled Pike to the barn first, then returned for Jessup, then Crenshaw. By the time she'd moved all 3, sweat poured down her face and her healing back screamed in protest, but she wasn't done. Inside the barn, she dragged the men one by one to the hog pen. The animals stirred immediately, sensing something. Their squealing grew louder, more excited. Dinah opened the gate to the pen. The hogs surged forward, but she blocked them with a piece of board. "Not yet," she whispered. "Wait." She positioned the first man, Pike, at the edge of the pen. His legs hung over into the enclosure, his torso still outside. The hogs pressed against her makeshift barrier, their snouts pushing, testing, hungry. Dinah looked down at Pike, at the man who had whipped her, who had laughed while doing it, who had terrorized her and everyone she cared about. "Now they know hunger," she said softly, repeating the words she'd thought so many times. And she removed the board. The hogs surged forward. What happened next was something Dinah would never speak of in detail, not even to herself in the quiet moments before sleep. The sounds alone would haunt her for the rest of her life. Though whether from horror or satisfaction, she was never quite sure. She did the same with Jessup, then Crenshaw. By the time the hogs were finished, there was nothing left but 3 pairs of boots, some scraps of clothing, and bloodstains in the mud that tomorrow's rain would wash away. Dinah closed the gate to the pen. The hogs, finally fed after 2 weeks of hunger, settled down contentedly. She stood there for a long moment, watching them, her face calm and expressionless. Then she cleaned herself as best she could, hid the wheelbarrow, made sure nothing connected her to what had happened here. The laudanum bottle went into the creek, weighed down with a rock. The rifle she wiped clean and returned through the window of the overseer's house, which she also wiped clean of any trace of her presence. By 3 in the morning, Dinah was back in her cabin. Thomas still slept, undisturbed. She lay down on her mat and closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she did not regret. Justice, she thought, was a strange thing. The law said what she'd done was murder. But the law also said she was property, less than human, something to be owned and used and discarded. So whose justice mattered? The master's or her own? Dinah didn't know the answer, but she knew that for the first time in 10 years, she felt something other than fear or numbness. She felt free. Morning came with rain, heavy, pounding rain that turned the red Alabama dirt to mud and made the fields impossible to work. Master Harrow stood on his porch, cursing the weather, while his enslaved people huddled in their cabins, grateful for the unexpected reprieve. Around 8 o'clock, one of the house servants came running through the rain, splashing through puddles, his face panicked. He ran straight to the main house and pounded on the door. "Master Harrow! Master Harrow!" The master opened the door, irritated at being disturbed. "What is it?" "The overseers, sir, they're gone." "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Their house is empty, sir. Door standing open, beds unmade, but no sign of them anywhere. Master Harrow's face darkened. Probably sleeping off drunk somewhere. Check the barn, check the... Already checked, sir. They're just gone. Within an hour, the entire plantation was in an uproar. Master Harrow organized a search party. They looked in the barn, in the fields, in the woods surrounding the property. They found nothing except, oddly, 3 pairs of boots near the hog pen. The boots were muddy and torn as if they'd been chewed. Hogs must have gotten into their things somehow, one of the searchers suggested. Maybe they left the boots outside and the animals got to them? It was a weak explanation, but no one had a better one. As the day wore on and no sign of the overseers appeared, Master Harrow became increasingly agitated. He questioned everyone. Had anyone seen the overseers last night? Had anyone heard anything unusual? No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The night had been quiet, peaceful even. The doctor was called to examine the overseer's house. He noted the bottles of laudanum, most of which were empty. They were taking quite a lot of this, he observed, more than I prescribed. Could have caused confusion, disorientation. Maybe they wandered off in a stupor. In their bare feet? Master Harrow demanded. Their boots were by the hog pen. I don't know, sir. I'm just saying the laudanum could have affected their judgment. The sheriff arrived in the afternoon, a fat man named Porter who hated riding in the rain. He questioned Master Harrow, examined the scene, and came to the same conclusion as everyone else. Nothing made sense. Could be they ran off, Porter suggested. Maybe they got scared of something, or maybe they were stealing from you and decided to flee before getting caught. They weren't thieves, Master Harrow insisted. They were good men. Good men who had beaten enslaved people for entertainment, but no one said that out loud. Well, sir, I don't know what to tell you. 3 grown men don't just vanish, but there's no sign of foul play, no blood, no bodies. I'll keep an eye out, put out a notice to other counties, but unless something turns up... He shrugged. Master Harrow was forced to accept it. The overseers were simply gone. He hired new overseers within the week. These men were less cruel than Crenshaw and his companions, though that wasn't saying much. They did their job, kept the enslaved people working, maintained order, but without the particular sadistic pleasure the previous 3 had taken in their work. Life at Harrow Plantation continued. The cotton was harvested, the fields were planted with winter wheat, the seasons changed, and no one ever found any trace of Crenshaw, Pike, or Jessup. Dinah watched it all unfold with careful attention. She answered questions when asked, her face showing appropriate concern. So terrible, sir. I hope they're found safe. She worked her usual hours, kept her usual pace, drew no attention to herself. But at night, alone in her cabin while Thomas slept, she would allow herself a small smile. Word spread among the enslaved people, though no one spoke of it openly. They couldn't prove anything. But they knew. They recognized the kind of justice that had been served, even if they didn't know the specifics. Old Moses nodded at Dinah one day in the fields, a brief acknowledgement. Ruth squeezed her hand while passing. Even Bessie, who knew more than anyone, simply said one afternoon, "Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways." Yes, Dinah agreed, he does. But Thomas was different. The boy was smart, observant. He'd noticed his mother leaving the cabin that night. He'd pretended to be asleep, but he'd watched through slitted eyes as she'd slipped out the door. One evening, about a month after the disappearance, Thomas finally asked. They were alone in the cabin, eating their meager supper of cornbread and beans. The fire crackled in the pit, casting shadows on the walls. "Mama," Thomas said quietly, "what happened to the overseers?" Dinah looked at her son, at his dark eyes that were so much like her own, at the way he watched her, waiting, knowing. "What do you think happened?" she asked. "I think—" Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think they got what they deserved." That's a dangerous thing to think. But true. Dinah was quiet for a long moment. Then she set down her bowl and looked directly at her son. Thomas, listen to me carefully. Whatever you think happened, whatever you believe, you never speak of it. Not to me, not to anyone, not in jest, not in anger, not even on your deathbed. You understand? Yes, Mama. Because the world we live in, it don't care about our reasons. It don't care about justice. It only cares about property and order. And if anyone even suspects... She let the sentence hang. I won't speak of it, Thomas promised. But Mama, I'm glad. I'm glad they're gone. I know, baby. I know. They finished their meal in silence, but something had shifted between them. An understanding. A shared burden that would tie them together for the rest of their lives. Master Harrow eventually gave up searching for his overseers. He claimed they'd stolen from him and run off north, probably to escape debts they'd accumulated. It was a face-saving explanation, one that didn't make him look like a master who couldn't control his own employees. The plantation continued operating. Cotton was planted and harvested. Money was made. Life, such as it was, went on. But something had changed at Harrow Plantation. The enslaved people carried themselves differently. There was a defiance in their eyes that hadn't been there before, subtle but present. They worked no faster than necessary. They took their breaks. They protected each other from the new overseers, warning of approaching trouble, covering for small infractions. It wasn't freedom. They were still enslaved, still suffering, still trapped in an inhuman system. But they had seen that the system could be resisted, that the powerful were not invincible, that sometimes, rarely, justice could be claimed by those who had been denied it, and they had Dinah to thank for it, though her name was never spoken in that context. She remained what she had always been, a quiet woman who worked hard, drew no attention, and survived. But now, when the other enslaved people looked at her, they saw something different, not a victim, not someone broken, someone who had pushed back against the darkness and won. 5 months after the disappearance, Master Harrow decided to sell the plantation. It wasn't a sudden decision. The disappearance of the overseers had shaken him more than he'd admitted. He'd become paranoid, suspicious, jumping at shadows. He drank more, slept less. His wife complained that he wandered the property at night, checking doors and windows, convinced that whatever had taken his overseers might come for him next. There's something wrong with this place, he told his wife one night, drunk and rambling. Can't you feel it? It's like the land itself is angry. You're being ridiculous, she said. But even she had to admit the plantation felt different now, darker somehow. The fields didn't yield as much as they used to. The animals were skittish, and there were sounds at night, strange sounds coming from the barn, like whispers or cries that could have been the wind but didn't quite sound like wind. The house servants heard the sounds too. They talked about it in whispers when the master and mistress weren't listening. Ghosts, some said, the overseers' spirits, trapped and suffering, calling out from whatever hell they'd been dragged to. Others said it wasn't the overseers at all. It was older ghosts, the spirits of all the enslaved people who had died on Harrow land over the decades, finally making their presence known. Dinah heard these whispers, but said nothing. She knew the truth. There were no ghosts, at least not supernatural ones, just wind through the barn's loose boards, just the normal sounds of a plantation at night, made sinister by guilt and fear. But she didn't correct anyone. Let them believe in ghosts. Let Master Harrow lie awake at night afraid. It was a small justice, but justice nonetheless. In March of 1843, Master Harrow accepted an offer from a plantation owner in Georgia. The sale included the land, the buildings, the equipment, and all the enslaved people. They would be transported en masse to their new master's property, where the cycle would begin again under a different name. The night before the sale was finalized, Dinah stood outside her cabin, looking at the fields she'd worked for 10 years. Thomas stood beside her, now 16 and nearly as tall as a man. "We're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, will it be better? The new place?" Dinah shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But we'll survive it, same as we survived this. Because we're strong, because we're patient, because we wait for our moment, because we remember." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mama, do you think what you did was right?" Dinah had asked herself that question every day for 5 months. She still didn't have a complete answer. "I think," she said slowly, "that right and wrong are luxuries for people who have choices. We don't have choices, we have survival. And sometimes surviving means doing things that haunt you." "Are you haunted?" "Every day, but not by regret." She looked at her son. "I took 3 lives, but I saved more than that. Every person on this plantation who won't be whipped by Crenshaw. Every woman who won't be violated by Pike. Every child who won't be terrorized by Jessup. Their futures are different because of what I did." "Then you're a hero." Dinah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, baby. I'm just a woman who got tired of being afraid." They stood together in the darkness, mother and son, bound by blood and by secrets that would never be spoken aloud. The next day, Harrow Plantation was sold. The enslaved people were loaded into wagons for the journey to Georgia. As they pulled away, Dinah looked back one last time. The barn stood dark and silent. The hog pen was empty. The animals had been sold separately. The fields stretched out in neat rows, waiting for new workers to plant new crops. And somewhere in that barn, maybe buried in the mud of the pen or scattered in pieces too small to recognize, were the remains of 3 men who had learned too late that cruelty has consequences. The plantation sat empty for 3 years before a new owner tried to make it operational. But the venture failed. Workers reported hearing things at night, screams from the barn, the sound of feeding, whispers that promised violence. Crops failed. Animals died mysteriously. Within a year, the new owner abandoned the property and moved east. The plantation was sold again and again and again. Each time the same problems arose. Each time the owners left, spreading stories about the cursed land, the haunted barn, the place where something terrible had happened. By 1850, Harrow Plantation had been completely abandoned. The fields grew wild, the buildings rotted, vines consumed the cabins, the barn collapsed in a storm, burying whatever secret still remained in its foundation. Local people avoided the property. They called it the place of pigs and ghosts. Though most had forgotten the origin of the name, they just knew that something bad had happened there once, something that had marked the land itself. On quiet nights, when the wind blew from the south and carried the smell of rain, people claimed they could hear a woman's voice, drifting across the abandoned fields. Mercy was not mine to give. It could have been the wind. It probably was the wind. But the locals crossed themselves anyway and hurried past, unwilling to linger near the ruins of a place where justice had been taken into scarred and desperate hands. Dinah survived another 23 years in slavery. She was sold twice more, moved from Georgia to Mississippi, and finally to Louisiana. She worked in fields, in kitchens, in laundries. She survived because that's what she did. She survived. Thomas grew into a man, was sold away from his mother when he was 20, and she never saw him again. It was the hardest loss of her life, harder even than the whipping, harder than the deaths of her other children, but she survived it. When the Civil War came and slavery finally ended, Dinah was 55 years old. She received her freedom on a humid afternoon in June of 1865, standing in a line of other formerly enslaved people while a Union soldier read from a proclamation she couldn't understand. Freedom. The word felt strange. What did it mean for someone who had been property for her entire life? Dinah took the name Freeman for her surname, a common choice among the newly freed. She stayed in Louisiana, working as a cook for wages that were barely enough to survive on, but were hers, earned by her labor, not stolen from it. She never married, never had other children, never spoke of her past except in the vaguest terms. "I worked on a plantation in Alabama once," she might say. "It was a hard life." Nothing more. But sometimes, on nights when sleep wouldn't come, she would remember. She would remember the feeling of the whip on her back, the sound of Thomas crying, the weight of years of accumulated rage, and she would remember 3 pairs of empty boots and the satisfied grunts of fed hogs, and the moment when she had looked at her hands and realized they were capable of more than picking cotton. She died in 1871, at the age of 61, in a small room in New Orleans. She died alone, but at peace. Her last words, spoken to the woman who ran the boarding house where she lived, were simply, "I did what I had to do." No one knew what she meant, but the woman nodded anyway and held her hand until she was gone. Dinah was buried in a pauper's cemetery, her grave marked only with a wooden cross that rotted away within 5 years. No one remembered where exactly she was buried. Her name faded from memory. But the story remained, passed down in whispers among families who had survived slavery. Embellished, distorted, mythologized, but always containing the core truth. Once, there was a woman named Dinah who had suffered greatly and who had made her oppressors pay. The details changed with each telling. The number of overseers varied. The method of their deaths became more gruesome or more poetic, depending on who was speaking. But the ending was always the same. Justice, the stories said, was not given from above. Sometimes it had to be taken from below. Sometimes the powerless found a moment of power and used it to reshape their world, even if only briefly, even if only in small and terrible ways. And sometimes, when all other options had been exhausted, when suffering had become unbearable, when the choice was between dying slowly or dying fighting, people like Dinah chose to fight. History would not remember her name. No monuments would be built. No books would be written with her as the hero. She would disappear into the vast, anonymous mass of enslaved people whose stories were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged, whose resistance was never celebrated. But she had existed. She had suffered. She had loved her children. She had endured the unendurable. And one night in Alabama in 1842, she had done something that changed the course of her life and the lives of everyone around her. She had fed 3 cruel men to starving hogs and called it justice. And maybe it wasn't justice in the legal sense. Maybe it was simply revenge. Maybe it was just violence, begetting violence in an endless cycle that had no heroes, only victims and survivors. But for Dinah, standing in that barn at midnight, watching the hogs feed, it had felt like the closest thing to justice she would ever know. And sometimes, in a world built on injustice, that was enough.